Thick over the mountains of eastern Kentucky hung the fog that October morning in 1963 when Dr. Thomas Reed first laid eyes on what would become one of the most disturbing medical cases in American history. Everything he thought he knew about human genetics and the consequences of extreme family isolation would be challenged by what he found in that isolated hollow. This is the story of the Whitmore Sisters. A discovery that for decades authorities tried to bury, and a family secret stretching back over a century. Dozens of communities cut off from modern society were still home to the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1960s. These weren't just remote places on a map. They were worlds unto themselves where families had lived for generations without outside contact, where the same surnames appeared on every tombstone in forgotten cemeteries, and where the gene pool had grown dangerously shallow. A young physician from Lexington, Dr. Reed, assigned to a rural health initiative, had heard rumors of unusual cases in the deepest hollows. But nothing prepared him for what he would encounter on that autumn day in Harlan County. Nearly 6 hours from the nearest paved road took the journey to the Whitmore property. Reed's guide, a local sheriff named Bill Crawford, had only agreed to make the trip after weeks of persuasion. Chains smoked the entire drive by Crawford, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of the old pickup truck as they navigated dirt paths that barely qualified as roads. These mountains he had grown up in, and their secrets he knew. He knew which families didn't welcome strangers and which places even locals avoided after dark. Dark. "I'm telling you now," Crawford said as they climbed higher into the mountains. "What you're about to see ain't natural. The Whitmore family, they've been up here since before the Civil War. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out. They marry amongst themselves. Have for generations. What that does to people? Well, you'll see for yourself." With the morning mist mixed the tobacco smoke as Crawford's truck finally came to a stop at the edge of a clearing. A structure that seemed frozen in time stood before them, a weathered cabin constructed from hand-hewn logs, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and decay. What remained of subsistence farming attempts surrounded the property. A few chickens pecking at the dirt, a small vegetable garden choked with weeds, and a well with a bucket hanging from a rotting rope. This was the Whitmore homestead, and it looked exactly like what it was, a place where time had stopped moving forward sometime in the 1800s. Before Reed could knock, the front door opened. A man emerged, his appearance immediately unsettling to the young doctor's trained eye. He appeared to be in his 50s, but could have been younger or much older. The unmistakable signs of generational inbreeding showed on his face, a pronounced prognathism that jutted his lower jaw forward, eyes set unusually wide apart, and a significant asymmetry in his facial features. His clothes were homemade and threadbare, and he regarded the visitors with a mixture of suspicion and fear. "I'm Jacob Whitmore," the man said, his speech slightly slurred due to his jaw structure. "You the doctor they sent?" Reed nodded, introducing himself while trying to mask his initial shock. Crawford had warned him. But seeing the effects of generations of close family reproduction in person was different from reading about it in medical textbooks. Inside Jacob led them, and the interior of the cabin was even more disturbing than the exterior suggested. The single large room served as kitchen, living space, and sleeping quarters. Covering the walls were photographs, dozens of them, spanning what appeared to be 100 years. Immediately Reed's medical training kicked in as he scanned the faces in those photographs. The family resemblance wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming. Across generations appeared the same distinctive features, the protruding jaw, the wide-set eyes, the unusual skull shapes. "My sisters are in the back room," Jacob said, gesturing toward a crude partition made of blankets hanging from the ceiling. "They don't come out much anymore." What Reed found behind that makeshift curtain would haunt him for the rest of his life. On a single mattress on the floor sat two women, surrounded by darkness, except for a sliver of light coming through a crack in the logs. At first glance, Reed estimated they were in their 70s or 80s. Their bodies were severely deformed, spines curved in ways that suggested multiple genetic disorders compounding over time. Their hands were gnarled, fingers fused together in places, and their faces showed the extreme end of what happens when the same genetic material repeats too many times without variation. The elder sister, who Jacob introduced as Martha, was 68 years old, but looked ancient. Her sister Sarah, just 2 years younger, appeared similar. But what struck Reed most wasn't their physical appearance. It was their eyes. Despite the profound physical deformities, their eyes were alert, intelligent, watching him with an awareness that made his chest tighten. Trapped in bodies that had betrayed them before they were even born were these women, cursed by decisions made by their ancestors generations ago. 3 hours Reed spent in that cabin performing basic examinations. Staggering were his findings. Martha and Sarah weren't just sisters. Genetic analysis would later confirm they were the product of multiple generations of uncle-niece and first-cousin unions going back at least 5 generations. First cousins had been their parents. Uncle and niece had been their grandparents. Second cousins who were also related through another line had been their great-grandparents. The Whitmore family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a tangled knot of repeated lines, the same names appearing over and over in different positions. Severe were the medical implications. A rare constellation of genetic disorders that Reed had only read about in the most extreme case studies was suffered by both women. Abnormally had their skeletal systems developed. Signs of malformation showed their internal organs, and their immune systems were compromised to the point where a simple cold could be fatal. Through sheer isolation and luck they had survived this long. Within days any exposure to common diseases could kill them. As Reed documented his findings, Jacob told him the family history. In 1847 had come to this hollow the first Whitmores, fleeing debt and legal troubles in Virginia. They were 2 brothers and a sister who built the original cabin on this spot. Within 10 years, the brothers had married their sister's daughters. Those unions produced children who then married each other. Generation after generation continued the pattern. The family grew, but it never expanded. New names never entered the family tree. The outside world was kept at bay, first by choice, then by necessity, as the physical effects of inbreeding became impossible to hide. "We ain't monsters," Jacob said as Reed packed his medical bag. "We're just what happens when people are left alone too long. My grandpappy used to say we were keeping the bloodline pure, keeping the family strong. But look at us now, document strong ain't the word I'd use." With his notes, his photographs, and a sense of moral obligation that would define the rest of his career, Reed left the hollow that day. To the state health department he submitted his findings, expecting immediate action. Instead, he encountered bureaucratic resistance and official indifference. In 1963, rural Appalachia was full of uncomfortable truths that society preferred to ignore. The poverty, the isolation, the consequences of generations without education or outside contact were problems too big and too expensive to solve. A footnote in a report that few people read and fewer acted upon became the Whitmore Sisters. But Reed didn't give up. He began researching the extent of consanguinity in isolated Appalachian communities. And shocking was what he found. The Whitmores weren't unique. They were just the most extreme example of a pattern that stretched across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. For generations entire communities had been marrying within their own families. Everywhere once you knew what to look for were the genetic consequences. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel because the stories we uncover here expose truths that have been buried for decades. And just the beginning of what we're about to reveal is the Whitmore case. To winter turned the autumn of 1963 and Drive Reed found himself increasingly obsessed with the Whitmore case. 3 more trips to the hollow he made before the first snow fell. New layers of tragedy and genetic devastation were revealed with each visit. On his second visit, Jacob introduced him to more family members who lived in smaller cabins scattered around the property. In total there were 16 Whitmores living on that mountain. All descended from the original 3 settlers from 1847. Of those 16, 11 showed severe physical deformities. 3 were confined to their beds, unable to walk due to skeletal malformations. 2 young children, no more than 8 or 9 years old, already displayed the characteristic jaw protrusion and cognitive difficulties that would mark their entire lives. Everything Reed documented with his camera, filling notebook after notebook with observations. Particularly disturbed him the children. Into this situation they had been born with no choice, no chance at a different life. By decisions made a century ago by people they would never meet had their fates been determined. The youngest child, a girl named Elizabeth, couldn't speak clearly due to a cleft palate and severe dental abnormalities. She followed Reed around during his visits, curious about the stranger from the outside world, but unable to ask the questions he could see forming in her eyes. Beyond primitive went the family's living conditions. They had no electricity, no running water, and no access to modern medicine. When someone got sick, they either recovered on their own or died. A small cemetery behind the main cabin showed Jacob to Reed where dozens of Whitmores were buried. Many of the graves were for children who hadn't survived past their first year. Astronomical was the infant mortality rate in the family, a direct result of the compounding genetic disorders. For every child who survived to adulthood, 3 or 4 others died in infancy. The scientific reality of what was happening to his family Reed tried to explain to Jacob. Diagrams he drew showing how genetic diversity was essential for healthy populations, how each generation of close relative reproduction increased the likelihood of recessive genetic disorders manifesting. Politely Jacob listened but seemed resigned to his family's fate. "Doc, I understand what you're saying," he said during one conversation. "But what am I supposed to do about it? We are who we are. We can't change what's already been done." The question haunted Reed. What could be done? Into every cell of every Whitmore family member's body was already written the damage. Generations of genetic deterioration you couldn't reverse. The best that could be done was to ensure no new children were born into this situation. But even suggesting that to Jacob felt like an impossible conversation. This was a family that had maintained the same patterns for over a century. Breaking that cycle would require intervention from the outside, and Reed was learning quickly that outside intervention wasn't coming. In January 1964, Reed submitted a comprehensive report to the Kentucky Department of Health. Over 200 pages long was the document detailing not just the Whitmore case, but his broader research into consanguinity in isolated mountain communities. He included medical records, photographs, genetic analysis, and specific recommendations for intervention. A coordinated effort involving social services, medical care, education, and gradual integration of these isolated families into broader society was called for by his proposal. Significant would be the cost, but Reed argued that the moral imperative was clear. These were American citizens living in conditions that would have been unacceptable in any developed nation. 6 weeks later came the response. A brief letter from a department official thanked Reed for his thorough documentation and assured him that his recommendations would be taken under consideration. Transparent was the letter's bureaucratic language. Nothing was going to be done. The Whitmores and families like them would continue to exist in their isolated hollows, slowly destroying themselves through genetic attrition. While the rest of society looked away, Reed's frustration grew into anger. He began contacting journalists, hoping to bring public attention to the situation. Several reporters made the trip to Harlan County, but their stories, when published, focused on the sensational aspects of the case rather than the systemic failures that had allowed such situations to persist. About mountain inbreeding and genetic freaks screamed headlines, language that Reed found repulsive. The Whitmores weren't freaks. They were victims of isolation, poverty, and generations of decisions made without understanding the biological consequences. Unwanted scrutiny to the Whitmore family brought the media attention, such as it was. Curious locals, who had previously left the family alone, began driving up the mountain to gawk at the cabin. A shotgun by the front door started keeping Jacob, not out of aggression, but out of fear of what might happen if the wrong people decided to cause trouble. Further into isolation retreated the family, and Reed found himself persona non grata when he attempted another visit in March. At the edge of the property Jacob met him and politely but firmly told him not to return. "You tried to help, document. And I appreciate that," Jacob said. "But all you did was make things worse. People know about us now, and they don't understand. They just want to stare. So, please just leave us be." Jacob's request Reed honored, but he couldn't let the matter drop entirely. To broader advocacy he shifted his focus, pushing for programs that would identify and assist isolated communities before they reached the point of genetic crisis that the Whitmores represented. He wrote academic papers, gave lectures at medical schools, and testified before legislative committees. Consistent was his message. Isolation combined with poverty created situations where families engaged in consanguineous relationships not out of depravity but out of simple lack of options. The solution wasn't condemnation but intervention, education, and connection to the broader world. For the next several years consumed Reed the work. A recognized expert on genetic disorders in isolated populations he became, consulting on cases across Appalachia and beyond. But his first case remained the Whitmore Sisters, the one that had opened his eyes to a problem he hadn't known existed. He thought about Martha and Sarah often, wondering if they were still alive, what their lives were like in that dark cabin in the Kentucky mountains. In the spring of 1968, Reed received a letter forwarded through the Harlan County Sheriff's Office. Crude but legible was the handwriting, and brief was the message. Killed by a falling tree while trying to clear land for planting was Jacob Whitmore. The letter was from a cousin, informing Reed that the family was struggling without Jacob, who had been the primary provider, and the connection to the minimal outside contact they maintained. The cousin asked if Reed could help arrange some kind of assistance, food supplies at minimum to get them through until they could manage on their own. Within a week Reed made the drive to Harlan County. Even more desolate than he remembered looked the hollow. A void that the remaining family members couldn't fill had left Jacob's death. The cousin who had written the letter, a man named Ezekiel, was in his 40s, but seemed ancient, worn down by years of hard labor and poor nutrition. To the main cabin he led Reed where Martha and Sarah still lived, now cared for by a younger woman named Rebecca, who Reed learned was both their niece and their first cousin, once removed. Significantly, in the 4 years since Reed had last seen them had deteriorated the sisters. Bedridden now was Martha, her body twisted into a shape that seemed barely human. Sarah could still sit up, but spent most of her time staring at the wall, trapped in some internal world that Reed's medical knowledge couldn't reach. Slowly they were dying, their bodies giving out organ system by organ system, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Regular food deliveries and some basic medical supplies Reed arranged for, working through local churches and charitable organizations. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was something. For the next 3 years he visited the hollow quarterly, watching as the Whitmore family slowly dwindled. Children died. Adults grew sick and never recovered. And the genetic burden that had accumulated over 5 generations continued its inevitable work. In the winter of 1971 died Martha Whitmore, succumbing to pneumonia that her compromised immune system couldn't fight off. She was 76 years old and had spent almost her entire life in that cabin, in that hollow, in that world of shrinking possibilities. Exactly 8 months later followed her sister Sarah, as if she'd been waiting for permission to let go. Both funerals Reed attended, standing in the cold mountain air as the few remaining Whitmores laid their family members to rest in that crowded cemetery behind the cabin. As the second funeral ended and the mourners dispersed, Reed found himself alone among the graves. Through them he walked reading names and dates where they were still legible. Whitmore after Whitmore, generation after generation, all buried on this single mountainside. The family that had come here in 1847, seeking isolation, had found it, had maintained it, and had paid the ultimate price for it. So shallow had grown their gene pool that it had effectively poisoned itself. And the evidence of that slow-motion tragedy were these graves. Standing there in that forgotten cemetery, Reed realized something that would shape the rest of his career. An anomaly weren't the Whitmores. They were a warning. They represented what happens when human populations become too isolated, when the same genetic material circulates through too few individuals for too many generations. Before in history it had happened in royal families and isolated island populations and remote villages around the world. Again it would happen if the conditions were right. The most extreme example he had personally encountered were just the Whitmores, but universal was the problem they represented. Foundational in the field of genetic counseling and population genetics became Reed's documentation of the Whitmore case. In textbooks appeared his photographs, carefully anonymized. Policy decisions about rural health care and the importance of preventing genetic isolation were informed by his case notes. But for Reed himself, real people remained the Whitmore sisters, not just case studies. They were Martha and Sarah, 2 women who deserved better than what genetics and isolation had given them. Never fully disappeared the Whitmore family. A few members moved away from the hollow in the 1970s, finally breaking the isolation that had defined them for over a century. They married outside the family, had children with diverse genetic backgrounds, and slowly diluted the concentrated genetic damage of previous generations. But the scars remained, both physical in those who carried the visible markers of their ancestry, and psychological in the knowledge of where they came from and what had been done to create them. By 1975 stood empty the main Whitmore cabin, slowly collapsing back into the mountain that had hidden it for so long. Dry went the well. To wilderness returned the garden, and began reclaiming the cleared land, the forest. Within a decade, you would have to know exactly where to look to find evidence that anyone had ever lived there. To silence returned the hollow, keeping its secrets beneath the thick canopy of Appalachian oak and pine. In 1989, Dr. Thomas Reed retired from active medical practice, but continued his advocacy work until his death in 2003. He never forgot the Whitmore sisters, and he never stopped trying to prevent other families from following the same path. In improved rural health programs, better education about genetic risks, and increased awareness of the dangers of population isolation lived on his legacy. But he would have been the first to admit that the work was never finished. That somewhere in remote corners of the world, other families were repeating the same patterns, creating new tragedies written in their DNA. For decades remained sealed the Whitmore case filed by the Kentucky Department of Health, finally being opened to researchers in 2015 under Freedom of Information requests. Even medical professionals who thought they had seen everything shocked what those files revealed. Far worse than had been publicly acknowledged was the extent of the genetic damage in the Whitmore family. The physical deformities that Reed had documented were just the visible symptoms of a cascade of genetic problems that affected every system in their bodies. Evidence of at least 40 distinct genetic disorders showed modern genetic analysis of preserved samples, many of them lethal when found in isolation, but somehow survived by the Whitmores through sheer biological luck. Debates about how society should respond to isolated communities at risk of genetic deterioration reopened the release of the files. For aggressive intervention, mandatory genetic counseling, and programs to encourage geographic and genetic diversity, argued some. That such approaches violated personal autonomy and cultural traditions countered others. The debate continued, informed by the Whitmore case, but extending far beyond it to questions of individual rights versus collective responsibility, cultural preservation versus biological imperatives. In the place where the Whitmore cabin once stood, hikers occasionally stumble upon remnants, a rusted bucket, fragments of hand-hewn logs, the outline of a foundation slowly disappearing into the forest floor. Few of them know the story of what happened there, the century-long tragedy that unfolded in that isolated hollow. Its secrets keeps the mountain as mountains always have, but through time echo the lessons of the Whitmore family for those willing to listen. Ultimately, a story about choices and consequences that stretch across generations is the story of Martha and Sarah Whitmore. It's about what happens when families become too isolated, when the same genes circulate through the same small group for too long. It's about the price of that isolation paid not by those who made the initial decisions but by their descendants who inherited the consequences. And it's about the responsibility of society to identify and assist populations at risk before they reach the point of biological crisis that consumed the Whitmores. Tools to understand and predict the consequences of consanguinity with frightening accuracy has given us modern genetics. We know now exactly what the Whitmore ancestors were doing to their descendants, even if they didn't understand it themselves. We know the mathematical probabilities of genetic disorders manifesting, the compounding effects of repeated close relative reproduction, the inevitable degradation of isolated gene pools. The knowledge we have. The question is whether we have the will to act on that knowledge to prevent new Whitmore families from being created. If you're watching this far into this investigation, it's time for you to engage with this crucial discussion. In the comment section below, write this exact phrase that represents what we've learned. They deserved better than isolation gave them. This simple act helps preserve these stories and ensures that families like the Whitmores are never forgotten or repeated. Your voice matters in keeping this history alive. Uncomfortable questions about how we define and protect human dignity also raises the Whitmore case. Into circumstances they didn't choose and couldn't escape were born Martha and Sarah Whitmore. By decisions made by ancestors they never met in a time when the science of genetics didn't exist were entirely shaped their lives. Their entire lives in that dark cabin they lived. From birth their bodies betraying them, their potential strangled by their own DNA. To people in such situations, what does society owe? What obligations do we have to prevent such situations from arising in the first place? These aren't just historical questions. Even today exist isolated communities where consanguinity rates are high and genetic disorders are becoming more common. Some are religious communities that discourage marriage outside the faith. Some are geographic populations in remote areas with limited contact with the outside world. Some are ethnic or cultural groups that maintain strong prohibitions against marrying outsiders. Not all of these communities will reach the crisis point that the Whitmores did, but the risk exists wherever populations become small and isolated enough. Before the full implications of their family's history could be understood and addressed, lived and died the Whitmore sisters. In a sense, they never wanted to be, were they pioneers, unwilling subjects in a natural experiment about the limits of human genetic tolerance for inbreeding. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it led to knowledge that could prevent others from experiencing the same fate. But that's cold comfort for two women who spent their entire lives trapped in bodies twisted by their ancestors' choices. In the years since the Whitmore case became public, several other similar cases have been documented in Appalachia and other isolated regions. None quite reached the extreme level of the Whitmores, but all showed the same basic pattern. Isolation plus time plus consanguinity equals genetic disaster. The communities varied in their specific circumstances, but the outcome was depressingly consistent. When human populations become too small and too isolated for too long, biology exacts a price. Particularly significant is what makes the Whitmore case is how thoroughly it was documented. Dr. Reed's meticulous notes, his photographs, his genetic samples, all of it survived and became available to researchers. A genetic time capsule became in effect the Whitmore family, showing exactly what happens when the same genetic material gets recycled through too few individuals for too many generations. The Whitmore case study medical students today, learning about the cumulative effects of inbreeding and the importance of genetic diversity. But behind every medical case is a human story. And one of profound sadness is the Whitmore story. Dreams once had Martha and Sarah Whitmore, as all children do. They had thoughts and feelings and hopes even if their bodies limited what they could actually accomplish. They loved and were loved by their family. They suffered, endured, and ultimately died in that isolated hollow. Their lives constrained by forces beyond their control or understanding. Better they deserved. Choices their ancestors' decisions had taken away they deserved. A chance at life that their genetics never allowed they deserved. Remote today remains the mountain hollow where the Whitmores lived for over a century, accessible only by difficult hiking trails and old logging roads. Around the place have grown local legends, whispered stories about the strange family that lived there, tales that mix fact with fiction until the truth becomes almost impossible to separate from mythology. But disturbing enough without embellishment is the truth, as documented by Dr. Reed and preserved in medical archives. The Whitmore family tree, when fully reconstructed, looks less like a tree and more like a rope. The same names winding around each other again and again. Brothers married sisters, cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. With such consistency repeated the pattern that geneticists have used the Whitmore pedigree as an example of the most extreme case of sustained consanguinity ever documented in the United States. If you trace any Whitmore's ancestry back far enough, you find the same individual appearing multiple times in different positions. Essentially had folded in on itself the family, becoming a closed genetic loop. In ways beyond just the physical deformities that Dr. Reed documented manifested the consequences of this genetic isolation. Common was cognitive impairment, though the extent varied significantly among family members. Of normal intelligence were some Whitmores despite their physical challenges. With basic cognitive tasks struggled others, their brains as compromised as their bodies by the accumulated genetic burden. Non-existent in the hollow were educational opportunities, so it's impossible to know how many Whitmores might have thrived intellectually given proper support and teaching. The chance to find out they never had. Rebecca Whitmore, the young woman who cared for Martha and Sarah in their final years, was one of the last Whitmores born in the hollow before the family began to disperse. She lived until 2012, spending her later years in a nursing facility in Lexington. A woman who was remarkably self-aware about her family's history and its implications found a journalist who interviewed her shortly before her death. "We paid for our isolation," Rebecca said, "paid with our bodies, our health, our lives. My great-great-grandparents thought they were building something pure and separate. All they built was a slow-motion tragedy." Rebecca's children and grandchildren carried the Whitmore genetics, but in diluted form, married as they were to people from outside the family. Some still showed mild physical characteristics, the prominent jaw, the wide-set eyes. But the severe deformities and health complications that had plagued the hollow-dwelling Whitmores didn't manifest. Essentially had rescued the family line the introduction of outside genetic material, proving what geneticists had long known: diversity is health. Isolation is danger. Into policy discussions about genetic testing, marriage laws, and public health interventions extend the broader implications of the Whitmore case. Should there be mandatory genetic counseling for couples who are closely related? Should governments maintain genetic registries to identify and track populations at risk of inbreeding? These questions touch on fundamental issues of personal freedom versus collective well-being. And frequently cited in these debates as an example of what can happen when no intervention occurs is the Whitmore case. That his attention and the subsequent media coverage stigmatized the Whitmore family and similar families throughout Appalachia have argued some critics of Dr. Reed's work. They point out that these families were victims of circumstance, not villains, and that sensationalizing their situations served no constructive purpose. This criticism Reed himself acknowledged later in life, admitting that his initial approach may have been insensitive to the cultural context and the dignity of the people he was studying. But he never wavered in his belief that documenting and understanding cases like the Whitmores was essential to preventing future occurrences. Some of the most powerful images in the history of medical genetics remain the photographs that Dr. Reed took in 1963. They show not monsters or curiosities, but human beings caught in circumstances beyond their control. Directly at the camera look Martha and Sarah Whitmore in those fading images with expressions that seem to ask why. Why them? Why this life? Why this suffering? The questions have no satisfying answers. By the time the original Whitmore cabin finally collapsed completely in 1987, only a handful of direct descendants remained in Kentucky. Most had moved to cities across the country, seeking anonymity and a fresh start away from the family's troubled history. They changed their names, avoided discussing their origins, and tried to build normal lives. Some succeeded. Others found that the psychological burden of their family history was as difficult to escape as the genetic one had been for their ancestors. A small exhibit about isolated mountain families now maintains the Harlan County Historical Society, including a section on the Whitmores. Tasteful and educational is the display, focusing on the historical context and the lessons learned rather than sensationalizing the family's suffering. From around the world come visitors to see it, drawn by an uncomfortable fascination with extreme cases of human genetics and social isolation. Some of Dr. Reed's photographs includes the exhibit, carefully selected to illustrate medical points without exploiting the subject's dignity. The day-to-day reality of life in that hollow cannot fully convey what the exhibit. The long winters with inadequate heating, the summers when the heat made the cabin unbearable, the constant struggle for food and basic necessities. The isolation wasn't romantic or peaceful. It was grinding poverty combined with the knowledge, at least in later generations, that something was profoundly wrong with their family, but without the resources or knowledge to change it. At least partially had understood Jacob Whitmore that his family's practice of intermarriage was destroying them. But two different things are understanding and having the power to change. Something both tragic and oddly hopeful about the Whitmore case has revealed modern genetic analysis. Despite 5 generations of extreme consanguinity, some family members were born relatively healthy. The genetic lottery, cruel as it was to Martha and Sarah and others, occasionally produced individuals whose particular combination of genes avoided the worst outcomes. The caretakers and providers for their less fortunate relatives often became these individuals, shouldering a burden they hadn't chosen. A blessing and a curse became their health, relative though it was, as they were expected to carry the family forward while watching their siblings and cousins suffer. A reflection on the Whitmore case and what it taught him about medicine, ethics, and human dignity was Dr. Thomas Reed's final publication before his death. He wrote about the importance of approaching every patient, no matter how unusual their circumstances, as a complete human being deserving of respect and compassion. He wrote about the dangers of letting poverty and isolation create situations where families have no good options, only varying degrees of bad ones. And he wrote about Martha and Sarah Whitmore specifically, two women he never forgot and whose memory drove his work for 40 years. They were not medical curiosities, Reed wrote in that final paper. They were people who deserved better than the hand genetics dealt them. If my work accomplished anything, I hope it was to ensure that future generations won't have to suffer the same fate, that we as a society will recognize the warning signs of genetic isolation and intervene before another family pays the price the Whitmores paid. Part of a larger state forest preserve is now the hollow where the Whitmores lived. Unaware of the history beneath their feet occasionally pass through hikers. The cemetery remains, though many of the markers have fallen or become unreadable. What was once the Whitmore homestead has reclaimed nature, erasing the physical evidence of their century-long presence. But the story remains, preserved in medical archives, historical records, and the memories of those who knew or studied the family. Into our present day echo the lessons of the Whitmore sisters. They remind us that isolation, whether geographic, social, or cultural, carries risks that compound over generations. They show us the absolute necessity of genetic diversity for human populations to remain healthy and viable. And they demonstrate the catastrophic consequences when families become trapped in cycles of consanguinity, unable or unwilling to break free until it's too late. Decades ago died Martha and Sarah Whitmore, but their story lives on as both a warning and a call to action. A warning about what happens when we allow populations to become too isolated, too cut off from the genetic and social diversity that human beings need to thrive. And a call to action to identify and assist communities at risk before they reach the point of crisis, to ensure that no more families have to live the tragedy that the Whitmores endured. If you watched until here, it's because you understood the importance of this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can meet you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. And if this investigation into the hidden truths of American history moved you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand how isolation and genetic consequences shaped real families. Make sure you're subscribed because we continue uncovering cases that authorities tried to bury, stories that need to be told, and truths that deserve to be known. The Whitmore sisters' story ends here, but their legacy continues in every effort we make to prevent such tragedies from happening again.